Mzikwangwa from the UDM. Mr. Kwangwa, your take on the minister's speech?
Well, firstly, I think we think that the minister did a good job or great job walking on a tightrope, but the bottom line is there's no growth strategy in that speech. It was a matter of the minister and his government trying to do damage control and managing this terrible situation the best they can. But from where we're sitting is that their priorities are a bit lopsided. For an example, you have a government that is going to give 16.4 billion rands to SAA over the medium term. That very same government only gives 2.2 billion rands to small businesses, which are important in reigniting growth. This country, for an example, as we stand now, we spend more money, more than 200 billion rands on debt service costs than we do on community development and economic development and other critical programs that would help us to reignite growth. The other aspect is that we obviously welcome the minister's decision to say some of the benefits and perks, including the salaries of SOE workers, need to be reduced significantly because that is where a lot of wastage takes place. He mentioned corruption in passing. He did not, like as was the case with the president, he didn't say anything concrete about what they intend doing about those who continue to loot state resources. It's concerning for us, for example, to say even the saving that is going to be made from the public sector wage bill will only be channeled towards SOEs like Escom and SAA and another wasteful expenditure that is taking place in the system, rather than putting some of those resources, once that important political balancing act and negotiation has been done with unions, to say how can we use those resources to reignite growth so that in the medium to long term we're able to employ more people in the sector once the economy grows properly.
Thank you very much for your time. That's the spokesperson of the UDM for finance, and it's back to my colleague, Bulelane.
Well, thank you so much, Manelis. Of course, continuing to take political reactions outside here of the parliament. Bringing into the conversation now Dr. Pieter Groenewald, the leader of the FF+. Of course, it's a wide-ranging issues that we could talk about, but of course, one of the issues we've talked about in the past is the issue of fighting corruption. Did the minister allocate enough resources for that fight?
Well, he allocated a couple of 100 million or so for the NPA and those structures to look at the corruption in South Africa, especially coming from the Zondo Commission. I'm not so sure whether that is enough. They said they're going to appoint about 500 investigators also to investigate, but I don't think that is enough. But I think the main thing is that everybody is relieved that personal tax and VAT has not been increased. The fact of the matter is still that if you look at the deficit, the budget deficit is already 6.5%, and it can increase to 6.8%. If you look at the gross debt situation of the government, it increases to 356 trillion, which is about 65.8% of the GDP. That is quite worrying. And we must also remember that there is a fuel levy of 25 cents per litre increase, which will be an effect on each and every consumer. Also the SOEs. Escom is receiving about 65 billion. And what worries the Freedom Front Plus is that the door to the government employees pension fund has not been closed. In fact, the minister said they will do everything to ensure that Escom survive and produce electricity. So that is worrying.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Pieter Groenewald, the leader of the Freedom Front Plus. Nombu, it's back to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. So we continue our conversation with Busisiwe Khadebe of Nedbank. Thanks again for joining us. So let's talk about the debt trajectory. So Tito Mboweni came out to say that for this fiscal year, our consolidated budget deficit is going to be sitting at 6.8% of GDP, and our gross national debt is going to be reaching about 3.56 trillion rand, which is 65.6% of GDP. Are these numbers going to be palatable to the ratings agencies?
I mean, if you look at it, you want to think of it a sustainable level of sort of debt to GDP, and usually that is around that 60% mark. So we're over that. In the medium term, we probably, I think, we're getting to about 71.6% of GDP. So it is over that mark, but debt is not all bad. It must be sort of what you're spending on the debt that you need to actually have a look at. And that's, I think, where we have gone slightly wrong. When we look at sort of current expenditure, a lot of that money has gone to go spend on current expenditure, and that's where we have gone wrong. So they're kind of saying to us in the budget review that when they look at that debt, they are sort of, they cannot actually really stabilize it at the moment because growth is so low. So we have to go to the markets and we have to borrow. But there is sort of still appetite for the markets out there for South African debt. So that's still carrying on. But I think at some point you have to look at other things to fix. So this time they did not look sort of on the revenue side of things, but there are bigger structural things that need to happen there so that we don't actually go to the market and keep on borrowing this money. So to credit rating agencies, I mean, it's the whole package that they're going to look at. They're not only going to look at this, they're going to obviously look at what's going on fiscally, but they're going to look at this and they're going to look at it and say, what are you spending that money on? That's the first thing. And they're going to look at what kind of policy environment do you have, and are you getting yourself out of the messes that you're getting yourself out of? Then they're going to look at what's going on with growth, and that looks abysmal. It is actually very pedestrian growth that we are forecasting, and they're going to look at the whole picture. So the Nedbank view is they're going to look at that picture, and there's probably in the next 2 months we probably might get that downgrade, but I think the market has already sort of discounted the fact that we're going to probably get that downgrade. But if you look at the figures, I mean, they don't look that nice in general.
Okay, Busisiwe, we're going to leave it there because we are toing and froing, but thank you so much for your insights. Busisiwe Radebe just giving us her insights there. We're going to cross over to my colleague, Manalisi. Manalisi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nompu, and I am joined now by the ANC spokesperson, Pule Mabi. Mr. Mabi, thank you very much for coming. Your take to the minister's speech?
Well, thank you very much as well. The minister has spoken to issues that bring about relief and stability to our own economy, and was quite realistic. I mean, he could not have been honest in the manner that he was. The fact that he's now beginning to focus us on investment in the future to make sure that the future generations could be able to construct a country of their own dreams as well. One, that we're turning South Africa into a construction site. This is going to be very critical towards the creation of jobs. The way we are dealing with our own GDP debt ratio to inflation is very important. It means that going into the future, we are sure that there could be a sense of stability. The establishment of a state-owned bank, the sovereign wealth fund, all of these are necessary measures to turn things around. But not only that, the president spoke about the building of a new university, and a new university that focuses on science, technology and innovation in Ekurhuleni. The minister has already announced on the sort of steps and the allocation of resources towards that work. This means that we are all pulling shoulder to wheel. The things that we in the ANC have spoken about, whether through our own Mahotlas, through the State of the Nation's address presented by the president here in the National Assembly, shows that we are committed to secure the future. That they've also spoken about the creation of new industries, funded amongst others through the carbon tax that shall have been created, bringing billions and billions of rands in the next few years, shows that there is some sort of a relief and a leadership that is reimagining how the future must begin to look like. But also, there is also an important focus on energy security. We believe, done well, this could also work towards the attraction of investment in our shores.
And I guess the ANC will fully support him when he cut the wage bill.
Well, of course, there are engagements that ought to be happening with the trade union movement. The president has already said that at the beginning of every month, he does those engagements, even through the NATLEC processes, to make sure that whatever interventions that are being made, we also take through with us other stakeholders. That there's not going to be an increase on VAT, that we are lessening on corporate tax. All of these measures are necessary to give our people relief, but allow those that are in business to be able to also participate without feeling any pressure.
My question was, will the ANC support him fully on cutting the wage bill?
My answer was that those engagements are happening at a different level. So the ANC will be guided by the outcomes of those engagements, because as the ANC and the leader of the alliance, we believe that we do not have to leave our alliance partners behind in the work that we are doing.
Pule Mabi, spokesperson of the ANC, thank you very much. And now I will cross over to my colleague Bulelani.
All right, thank you so much, Manelisi. Of course, now we're going to bring into conversation IFP spokesperson on finance, Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi. Is this a pro-poor budget?
This budget is not pro-poor at all. But we appreciate the minister's honesty, because what he was doing was telling the country that our country is not at all in a good space, that our economy is not growing, which is very bad news for the mass unemployed. So as the IFP, we thought that even the 63 billion, which is a downward revision, wasn't going to target departments like human settlement, because we've got millions of our people who are homeless and are living in shacks, and also that he has cut so much on the Department of Education, yet we've got people who don't have even classrooms to learn from. So that is why we are saying this budget was never pro-poor at all, but we're very good that he was very honest. But we're also happy that the minister touched on a little bit on the issue of dealing with corruption and maladministration and wasteful expenditure. But we yet to see how is that going to be implemented, because we have had so much talks around those issues, but no implementation at all. And also we spoke about the issue of the sovereign wealth fund. We appreciate that and we'll come to the IFP, but only if we haven't done with the issues of corruption and maladministration. That will be one of those entities that will be looted, like the VPS of the likes. So we say if the government is serious, we must first put a stop on all the leakages before we can consider anything that is progressive.
All right, thank you so much, Nkosi Mzamo Buthelezi. He's the spokesperson on finance for the political party, the Ngata Freedom Party. Nompu, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. Of course, we continue to unpack the budget delivered by the Finance Minister. I'm joined in studio now by Elna Moorman. She's an economist at Standard Bank. Thank you very much, Elna, for joining us.
Good afternoon.
Let's focus a little bit on the shortfall in terms of revenue collections. In the midterm budget, the Finance Minister expected that to be at about 52.5 billion rand, but that's shot up to something like 63 billion rand. That's not a very good picture, and it tells us that SARS is really struggling to collect revenue.
Yes, and of course it's partly reflective of how weak the economy is. The problem with those kinds of shortfalls, because the shortfalls partly comes from the revenue side, is just that it then creates a very weak base effect. In other words, if I didn't get enough revenues last year, then my growth this year comes from a lower base, and so it has a long-term effect if we have these revenue under recoveries. But I have to say that, to my mind, is one of the upside risks in terms of the fiscal picture. So the downside risks are very obvious. The downside risks to growth and therefore tax collections, I think, are quite well known.
Yes.
But there's a lot of talk in the budget documents about the turnaround at SARS and the increased efficiencies, etc. Treasury hasn't yet included any numbers on the back of that into the fiscal forecasts. But the estimates that we've heard are quite significant. So maybe that is something that then ultimately at least counteracts the downside risks.
And then, of course, in terms of the debt trajectory, we did talk about it with Busisiwe, but we couldn't speak about it at length. 65.6% debt to GDP ratio. That's quite huge. And what does that then do from a ratings agency perspective?
Yeah, I sometimes think that it's a little bit abstract to understand whether 65% is affordable or not, but I think that the way to look at it this is to say by the end of the 3-year forecast period, our interest will be 300 billion rand. We're spending less than 200 billion on social grants in total. And we can compare that 300 billion to the 160 billion that we spent on interest in 2016. And so it's not only the fact that we're saying we're spending this on interest costs instead of all the social needs, firstly, but secondly, that pace of increase on both debt and debt servicing is just alarming, and that is the unsustainable part. And from a ratings agency perspective, to my mind, that's the issue that will still negatively affect the ratings assessments.
And we continue to bankroll SAA, Escom. We continue to channel funds in there, although that's not a surprise. We knew that was coming. But what signal does that send?
Yeah, I feel like the important takeaway from the fiscal approach over the last, let's say, 2 years is we have to acknowledge that these problems were kind of growing over a 10-year period. It was a decade of building up these problems, and we shouldn't expect them to be reversed quite quickly. So at the moment, all we can do is give some money and liquidity so that we have time to address the underlying problems. But hopefully, we're now starting to get closer to that point where we get more final decisions on SAA and Escom, so that we have clarity on where the end is of the fiscal transfers to these SOEs.
Of course, the public sector wage bill, that's going to be a huge deal. Negotiations for the next 3 years will be taking place later in the year. The finance minister has already factored in numbers where he's estimating the kind of cuts he'll be able to make. Do you think that's going to be a big fight for him going down the line?
I think it's going to be a big fight, but I think we've reached the point where we don't really have any alternative. We've increased taxes to very high levels already, and on the spending side, they have already trimmed a lot of the fat. There's probably still some corruption that needs to be addressed, but we don't have an alternative. And so I think we need to look at it from two perspectives. The first is to say he had to include his best guesses. So even though we don't have the wage agreement yet, that is his best forecast. But secondly, to say this is what we can afford. We have a number of ways of getting there. It can either mean that we have more affordable wage increases, or it would have implications for example, employment numbers. So there's some maneuvering that can still happen, but that's all that we can afford.
All right. We're going to leave it there for now, Elna. Now we're going to cross to my colleague, Manelisi.
Thank you very much, Nompu. I'm with the leader of the EFF, Julius Malema, with me. Mr. Malema, you must be happy with this budget, ultimately.
It's not a very bad budget under the circumstances. We welcome the establishment of a state-owned bank, the Sovereign Wealth Fund. We also welcome the fact that the minister is trying to ensure that small business becomes the biggest beneficiary out of state spending. But we are disappointed that he has reduced the allocation of local government from 10% to 8.8%, because majority of our people, when they refer to government, they refer to local government. They don't know international relations, they don't know small business, they know local government, and therefore the EFF always advocated for more money to be allocated in local government. We are opposed to renegotiation of the agreement with the workers, the public servants, because that agreement was reached and it was supposed to last for 3 years. And to come in the middle of the agreement, say, let's renegotiate, is to tamper with the planning of the workers. We welcome the money into the SAA, welcome the money into Escom.
But still there, Mr. Malema. But doesn't he have to cut the budget, though? I mean, the wage bill, though.
No, he can cut the wage bill going forward. But the agreement, as we speak now, it has been reached. It must be honored. Every agreement should worth the paper written on. Because if we can just renegotiate in the middle of an agreement, it's taking us back to those days where negotiations take place every year and there is no certainty of what is going to happen.
But doesn't the EFF become flexible here, because the circumstances that prevailed then are no longer there right now? We're in a very, 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 very bad economic situation.
There are many areas where we can cut just to honor this agreement and see it through. And when we go back to the bargaining council, we renegotiate a better deal. There are many areas which, if we sit down with the minister, we can be able to point in those areas and say to him, Minister, it is not necessary for the state to continue to fund some of these unnecessary programs. Let's honor the deal and see it through, because those workers are not going to be happy. And if we can see an industrial action by workers, especially now under the circumstances, our situation will be worse.
Mr. Malema, thank you very much for your time. That's the president of the EFF, Julius Malema, totally opposed to the renegotiation of the agreements between the minister and the civil servants. Nompu, back to you.
Thanks very much, Manelisi. Well, to get a business perspective on the finance minister's budget, I'm joined in studio by Mike Brown. He's the CEO of Nedbank. Thanks very much for joining us, sir. So what's your overall view of the budget this year?
I think the budget shows you just what a difficult place the South African economy is right now, because effectively what you see is the low rates of GDP growth, and all of them have been revised downwards again from the medium-term budget statement, and actually now look much more realistic, in line with where most market commentators' expectations are for GDP growth. But as soon as that GDP growth number gets revised downwards, what does it mean? It means government's revenue is under pressure. If the economy is producing less, government is going to get less taxes. And where the ministers had to focus is on expenses, because that revenue line is under so much pressure. So I think rightly he's had a big focus on expenses. The key is, can he actually deliver the savings that he has spoken about in the short to medium term? And the real key for South Africa is we really need the structural reform in our economy, a lot of it that's set out in the Treasury paper, to boost GDP growth rates. That's the only way we can get our country's debt levels back under control again, is through growth. In the short term, we can do things on expenditure, but over the longer term, it has to be through growth.
You run a bank, you know a lot about capital markets. Are we going to dodge the ratings downgrade?
I think it's going to be really close, because if you look effectively at what's happened to deficits and debt to GDP, which is what the rating agencies will be really focused on, they get worse in the short term than what was in the medium-term budget statement. So the fiscal deficits are higher than what we told the world about in November, but right at the back end of the budget, they start to get better again. So I think, we may have done enough that they watch to see, can we actually deliver this trajectory? Because somewhere debt does need to consolidate or reduce. And right now it's still going up, and that's a problem.
Do you get the sense that we're getting enough detail about infrastructure spending or not?
Yeah, so I think, in short, I think we do need more detail. There's a lot that is said, and what people are really focused on is, when does it turn to action? So, for example, fantastic that the minister focused on consistent, reliable energy supply as the number one problem facing our economy. If we don't have that, we cannot grow by more than around about 1%. So we've had lots of conversations around municipalities being able to procure their own energy, businesses being able to set up their own energy generation. But what people are going to really focus on is, when does the first one of those switch on? Not when people stand up and talk about policies. Yes. When do we actually get something connected to the grid and real net positive input into the electricity?
Are you worried that implementation continues to be a problem, or should we just wait and see?
No, I think we're all very worried that implementation continues to be a problem. We've had, a number of years of a big deficit between what we say and what we do, but we've kicked the can right to the very end of the road. Debt to GDP numbers that are projected to go well above 70%. There's no more space. So we're in last chance saloon for implementation.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Mike, for your insights. That was Mike Brown, the CEO of Nedbank. We're going to go over now to my colleague Bulelani.
Well, thank you so much, Nompu. Of course, the biggest question is whether this budget, is it business friendly? To talk to me more about this now is the president of the Black Management Forum, Andile Nomlala. Thank you so much for joining me. Did the minister strike a right chord for business?
Most definitely for black business. We are too pleased, particularly about the detail that is yet to come on the state-owned bank. I'm worried about some terminologies that he used on it leaning too commercially. I mean, we had experiences with the current existing commercial banks, but as black business, we're not going to necessarily have a negative view about it now, because we have the opportunity in any case to talk to the minister and deal with the detail. Another positive aspects about the budget is the creation, obviously, of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and I would believe that South Africa, despite the fact that others are saying that we don't have surplus budget at the moment, but there are many strategic mineral resources that we can use and divert equity holding to government so that we can fund for the future. We are very pleased as black business by the idea of infrastructure spending, and we are actually now looking more on capital expenditure than OPEX. And as black business people, will be in partnership with government in making sure that those projects are being realized and black business is prioritized. For us, we don't have much to cry, because government is our government. We will engage with them. Where we differ, we'll differ robustly so, but where we support, we'll be there to help and give a hand.
All right, thank you so much, Andile Nomlala. He is, of course, the president of the Black Management Forum. Nombu, it's over to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. Well, Mike Brown has now gone, and I'm joined in studio by the Deputy Finance Minister, Mr. David Masondo. Thanks very much, sir, for joining us.
Thanks, Nompu.
Good stuff. So, government has decided, National Treasury has decided to cut expenditure on non-interest priorities, your education, police, social security, etc., to the tune of 156 billion rand over the next 3 fiscal years, something like that. What is the basis of that? Because obviously we know that you're looking to cut the public sector wage bill, but you haven't begun negotiations with the sector to be able to properly estimate how much you'd be able to cut that by?
The reason why we decided to cut the expenditure by 261 billion is mainly because our public debt is 3.5 trillion and we pay 250 something billion on interest. I mean, as you know, in your household, if you have got debt, your expenditure is high, your income is low, you've got to do something about that situation. And therefore we said, given the limited resources that we have as government, we've got to cut somewhere, including sacrificing certain expenditure items, as you correctly say, education, some infrastructure, as well as transportation. And we are beginning to negotiate, have discussions with the public sector workers around the wage bill, which is one of the major costs insofar as our ability to deliver service as the public service as a whole. And I must indicate that the public servants, workers, they are better off today in terms of the income that they basically get, because they got wage increases 2003, 2011, 2010, which were higher than the inflation. And once you set a wage at a particular level, you have to pay it over time. So we're beginning to have conversations around that on how can we just make sure that we're not focusing on the wage bill only. There are a number of items that we're looking at, including at the cost, the amount of money that we pay for public representatives. I mean, for instance, the president has decided that there will be no increase for public representatives, including myself, because all of us, we've got to take responsibility and feel the pinch of the cut of this budget.
Yes. So would you describe this as an austerity budget? Because, you know, there is a concern that when you cut spending, particularly on key services, we know that in, you know, certain areas there are not enough nurses, there are not enough police officers, there are, you know, not enough doctors and so on and so forth. How do you get the balance right between ensuring that quality services are given to the public while you're busy also cutting the wage bill?
So this is a tough budget, but it's not an austerity budget. If it was austerity, we'll be saying we're stopping social grants, we must cut on the teachers that we basically have, the nurses, the police. All what we are saying is that the wage price that we pay for public servants is very high, and it makes it very difficult for us to get more nurses, more teachers, into the public service, and that has an impact on our ability to deliver the service to the people. Therefore, we're saying let's have a conversation around the wage bill so that we'll have the monetary power and ability as the state to get more people into the public service, because the population is also increasing, but the number of the public servants is stagnant, and precisely because of the wage bill. And we're saying let's have a conversation around the price of labor in the public service. Actually, it does increase above the average increase in the economy as a whole.
Now, you can't please everyone when you deliver a budget, of course, but why are we continuing to fund SAA?
So SAA, we said they need to restructure, and part of the restructuring, they need to look at their business model. Because the business model that they have is not sustainable. Other airlines, their business model is integrated with their hospitality. For instance, they will say, we have a close connection. If you book a flight in country X using that airline, they give you the total package, accommodation, and other services which are related to the hospitality industry. In our case, the business model of SAA is basically outdated, and they need to look at that. And for them to put SAA on a different path, they need some money, and that money that we're allocating to them, it's meant to help them to restructure SAA in order for it to be commercially viable, to aid and support our economy including tourism.
Tell us about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I see that you're going to be putting some 30 billion rand into it, but where are you going to be sourcing the funds?
So we'll get it from some of our reserves, and the point about Sovereign Wealth Fund, you're saving money for the rainy days, because the economy is never static. That moments when it goes down into recessions, so you want to have enough resources even for those rainy days. And it's for this reason that we're setting up the Sovereign Wealth Fund, taking some money from the reserve, not only going forward. I mean, if we sell the spectrum, we will say, let's take some of the money into the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the minerals, royalties, let's take some money into the Sovereign Wealth Fund. And many countries, China, Singapore, they do have their own sovereign wealth funds, and they use them strategic. So, and what we'll be doing now is also to set up proper governance structures and processes, so that that money is not used in a manner that is not beneficial to the South African economy and the South African citizens.
We only have very little time left, but it is encouraging to see that you've confirmed what the President said in the State of the Nation address, that indeed funds are going to be released for grade R to grade 3 learners in terms of them being able to code and do robotics. But what's the quantum? That wasn't very clear. And of course, how do you ensure, because this is a new area, how do you ensure that those children are taught by people who do know about these particular disciplines, because it is a new thing?
I think the Minister of Education, she will give the details when she presents her budget vote on how she will translate the allocation that we've made to education to make sure that indeed the objectives that the President has articulated in the State of the Nation address are realized.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was David Masondo. He's the Deputy Finance Minister, and he was just giving us an overview of the budget. Now we're going to cross to my colleague, Manelisi.
Thank you very much, Nompu. I'm now joined by the NFP spokesperson, Sheikh Imam. Sheikh, the minister tried to strike a very delicate balance under very difficult fiscal circumstances.
Yes, indeed. I think a very balanced budget today by the minister, and I think he's done exceptionally well, with much of the emphasis on economic development. For the first time, I think the emphasis has been on the economic cluster. Previously, remember, the emphasis used to be on education, on health. I think here what is done today is a fantastic job, and I think if implemented, yes, indeed, I think we can turn the tide around.
And you also mentioned something about improving our electricity supply. Are you satisfied on that sphere?
Yes, indeed. You remember that is going to impact on economic growth in the country, you know, with the challenges we have, particularly with Escom at the moment. He has spoken about it. He is very, very clear about it. You can see he's going into independent public power producers. He's talking about municipalities being able to buy their own electricity. And I think that will do good for the country at this point. I think the only concern is this, when it is privatized and goes into independent power producers, is there not a risk at some stage for the cost of electricity to escalate, which will be beyond the reach of ordinary South African? And that's what I think we're going to have to be careful about.
Sheikh Imam, thank you very much for your time. And that is the NFP spokesperson, Sheikh Imam. And now I cross over to my colleague, Bulelani.
Thank you so much, Manelisi. Of course, now joining me is the president of the AIC, Mr. Mandle Nkosi Galo. Sir, is this a pro-poor budget? Does it assist the men and women staying in rural areas?
We are very much disappointed by the budget speech by the minister, because it is not people-centered. For instance, take the allocation of 420 to your local municipalities. That money is very, very little, given the fact that the municipalities at that level are expected to deliver services to the poorest of the poor masses. But if you will allocate just 420 billion, that is an insult. We are tired of seeing protest activities, violent protest activities, simply because the people at that level are demanding services from the same municipalities which are not being supported by the central government. We are saying we are not happy with this budget, but we must appreciate the fact that the minister has increased a little bit, on your social grants and your child support grant. But that is not enough as well. We thought that the minister will increase the social grants a little bit because the grannies are suffering. They are feeding their own grandchildren with this money. At the same time, they are expected to look after their health, so on and so forth. So that is very, very little, but we appreciate that he thought of increasing that amount.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mandla Nkosi Galo. Of course, he is the president of the African Independent Congress. For more reaction, Manelisi is standing by.
Thank you very much, Bulela. I'm now joined by the leader of Al Jama, Mr. Hendricks. Mr. Hendricks, are you happy? Are you not happy about the budget?
Yeah, very happy that there's no VAT increase and that a lot of taxpayers will get the tax reduction. Also very excited that we are getting closer to creating the 100,000 business opportunities for young people. 2.2 billion has now been set aside for SEDA to allocate. We are a bit worried that the loans to start up businesses for young people will attract interest. SEDA charges too much interest. The president, the minister should have announced measures. He spoke about interest-free commitments. He should have also indicated that these loans would be interest-free. So while the businesses, there's hope for small businesses, very disappointed that the minister did not allocate any money for NGOs to address gender-based violence. You can't depend on government departments to address it alone. And NGOs cannot assist if they also get funding. The idea of a state bank is very exciting. We originally heard that they will only take deposits, but now they will also give loans. In the Small Business Portfolio Committee, we are going to lobby that the loans given especially to entrepreneurs must also be interest-free so that they can become profitable as soon as possible. As far as the old age pension is concerned, we welcome the 80 Rand, but we feel the government must move closer so that pensioners get at least 3,000 Rand a month.
Don't you think he gave with one hand and took with another when he increased the petrol prices?
Yes, most of us walk. Most of South Africans walk, so it doesn't affect them a lot, but obviously they will have to, those who can afford taxis and buses will have to pay more. So yes, I do agree that there was a balancing act, and our minister has to balance a lot of interests, and he also has to balance the interests of the different factions in the ruling party, and that makes his job very difficult.
Mr. Hendricks, thank you very much. That's the leader of Al Jama, Mr. Hendricks. Nompo, it's back to you again on the studio.
Thanks very much, Mandlisi, for that. Well, in studio now, I'm joined by Delia Ndlovu. She's the MD for Deloitte Africa Tax and Legal. Thanks very much for joining us. Good stuff. So, a huge surprise that the finance minister didn't really raise any of the major taxes, but was it a surprise for you?
I think it wasn't, in the sense that he focused a lot on fiscal consolidation, which is what the country needs right now. So you've heard a lot about the Laffer curve, which is essentially the law of diminishing returns, that you can only raise taxes up to a point. So I think there is a realization from Treasury's side that households are under strain at the moment. Raising taxes would actually hurt the economy. And with the rating agencies looking at us as a country, they took a view, I think, to say, let us put the brakes on increasing taxes. And in fact, the minister mentioned something about possibly phasing out incentives and looking further into reducing corporate tax rates in the future.
It is worrying, though, that the average growth rate that the Treasury predicts is around 1% over the next few years. And we know that international bodies and other bodies actually expect that come this year we're going to grow at sub 1%. So given that, and given what you've said about that Laffer curve, that you can only tax so much as that applies to personal tax and corporate tax, surely that also applies to things like the fuel levy and so on, because if we keep on getting these compound additions of taxes on these things that we need to pay for because we need to move by car and so on and transport, surely at some point they won't be able to tax us as well going forward.
I have to say that just based on what I heard, the increases that he mentioned, to me it was just inflationary increases. There was nothing in there that gave me alarm around the fact that this is a hefty sort of increase. It sounded like he's just increasing just mildly to match with inflation.
Yes.
And I think what is also important to notice is that he also gave relief to the middle class, as well as the low-income earners, in the sense that he said that someone earning 10,000 rand will now pay 10,000 less tax, and those earning around 100,000 will pay about 1.5% less tax. So I think that is a good thing.
From your perspective, does the tax situation suddenly change the mindset of a potential business investor in South Africa to say, well, things are not looking too hectic and they're talking about cutting corporate income taxes, maybe I can invest there, or it's too early?
I think it's a step in the right direction to boost business confidence. Because what the rating agencies keep telling us is that in order to improve your economy, you need to look at stimulating demand of households and stimulating demand in the private sector. So I think that is top of mind for Treasury at the moment, which is why I think they went the route that they went, with focusing more on reducing the wage bill in the public sector and leaving households alone, and in fact giving the middle class some sort of relief.
Do you think that there could have been a bit more relief for SMEs, because that's supposed to be the sector that's going to bring us the real job creation?
I think the minister did mention something around the youth employment initiative and also looking at entrepreneurship in that program. So the fact that the leadership is focusing on this, we need to give them a chance to see what they come back with. The president mentioned it in his SONA statement, so did the minister. So we need to give it a bit of a chance, but take hope from the fact that leadership is giving it a fresh look, and entrepreneurship is top of mind for them.
Super. Delia, thank you so much for your time and your insights. That was Delia Ndlovu. She's the MD for Deloitte Africa Tax and Legal. Now we're going to go back to Bulelani.
All right, thank you so much, Nompu. Of course, now joining me is SARS Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kisweta. Sir, did you push for more taxes for this budget, given that you want to collect more?
Bulelani, I think the decision in the Treasury family is that there is every intention to provide tax relief and not increase taxes. We've reached the point where we believe that tax generally is a blunt instrument, and by just raising taxes now you don't get a better outcome. In fact, you get a worse outcome, because you take money out of the economy that could be doing other things and have multiplier effects. And secondly, you also begin to negatively impact on compliance culture, which is a huge area of concern. Tax revenue is driven by three things. Firstly, tax policy on any given economy. Secondly, the public confidence and compliance levels. And thirdly, the capability of SARS to administer its laws. On the tax morality, we have seen a decline in tax morality. We have seen an increase in criminal activities, an increase where, quite frankly, certain individuals create businesses with no other intent but to defraud the fiscus. We are busy with 600 cases of VAT fraud. Last week we saw 2 individuals being criminally prosecuted for that. We will intensify that effort. And then thirdly, we know that the capability of SARS has been compromised. And so building that, particularly in 3 areas, is important for us. Firstly, in terms of our technical skills, audit capability, investigative capability, very important. Secondly, in the use of data. using more machine learning and artificial intelligence. We've got enormous stores of data that we can improve the use of. And then thirdly, delivering digital online services that just makes fulfilling your compliance obligations so much more efficient.
Talking about your investigative capacity, can you give us assurance that whatever investigations that you're doing will be above board and in compliance with the law?
There is no question. I have red carded any behavior by any SARS official that is not beyond reproach. So we will only tolerate a fair, even-handed approach by SARS. We act without fear, favor or prejudice. If any individual, and if the public reports to us an individual who has broken that oath of secrecy or who have broken the trust that is placed on them, there is no place for such people in SARS. Just last week, we had an individual resign because of an incident where they abused their power. We will not tolerate it. You cannot have confidence in us if you don't believe that we will be fair and firm.
I want to get your opinion. Was there not a rogue unit within SARS from what you understand as now the incumbent?
My opinion. So here is what we know. We know that the NPA has decided that there's no evidence to prosecute the matter further. Secondly, KPMG, who produced a report, have withdrawn that report. Thirdly, the judge who was involved in an investigation gave an unqualified apology for that. Fourthly, the matter that the public protector is being dealt with, we are taking on review in the normal way that we should, right? Lastly, not my opinion, but my observation is I have seen no evidence that suggests that SARS has created any capacity or entity to do anything which is not fairly and squarely permitted in law. We follow the law in its full extent, and we do so in a professional manner without fear and favor. Will it step on people's toes? Of course it will. And you have to make up your mind. So I'd like to hear your opinion when you listen to the detractors, when you listen where the voices of dissent are coming from. Ask yourself what's their real motive.
Lastly, Mr. Kesweta, before I let you go, will you release the bank statements of former President Jacob Zuma?
Let me talk about taxpayer confidentiality. This has nothing to do with an individual. Individual taxpayers, whoever you are, whether you're the president or a normal township dweller, you're entitled to the same treatment in law. There's no different law for big people or small people or rich people or poor people or companies or individuals. The same law across the board. Therefore, every taxpayer, we will apply the confidentiality of. There are only two instances where we will set that provision aside. The first is if the taxpayer gives us written permission, which we can verify that he or she is comfortable with us doing that. And secondly, if we are instructed to do so through a court order.
All right, thank you so much, SARS Commissioner, Mr. Edward Kesweta, giving us a lot of issues that affect his portfolio. Going back to studio now, Nompu is standing by.
Everybody. Thanks very much, Bulelani, for that. Well, I'm joined in studio. We're just rolling in the guests today. I'm joined in studio by Isaiah Mhlanga. He's chief economist at Alexander Forbes, and Titi Hatendi Matika. She's the head of retail investment, and she is from ABSA. And they're just joining me now to just give us their insights on the budget. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Titi, let me start with you. Was this, in your view, since you look after the retail sector, was this very much a consumer budget?
Yes. So for once, there was quite a bit of relief for the consumer, and one could argue that the consumer could take a little bit more, particularly high net worth individuals, but we've seen the numbers. We've seen that your high net worth individuals have been leaving South Africa in higher numbers, and those are the people who are actually supporting the tax base. So it's a very positive budget, especially for the middle income also people. We saw that the lower income got quite a bit of relief, particularly when it comes to the taxes. And then also for first-time buyers, having $1 million and lower being exempt to transfer duties, that's quite positive.
Yes.
Lower sin taxes, lower fuel levy, very good. So positive on that side.
And then in terms of our budget deficit, that's gone to around 65.5% of GDP. We've got a debt stock of 3.56 trillion rand. That's a lot of money. But when you think about it in the context of the ratings agencies, is that good enough?
I don't think it's nearly good enough, because if you look at our debt to GDP ratio, it continues to rise. If you look at the primary balance, which National Treasury said in the last MTBPS that it's going to close in 2022-2023, now it's saying it's no longer possible, which means we don't achieve any debt sustainability. From a credit rating agency, it's negative. But one thing I think that you can give to Treasury, they said we are not going to consolidate at all costs. So we can let the fiscal slip a bit, so that we can stabilize SOEs, largely Escom, so that we can provide stable electricity, which can support economic growth.
Yeah.
But in so doing, it means we lose part of the fiscal credibility that we had. Because remember, fiscal credibility means when you tell the market this is what you're going to do, you actually do it and achieve it in the time frame that you say. Failure to do that means the market is no longer going to believe you the next time you table a budget. And that has implications for two things. One, the interest cost for the state rises, because bond yields will remain quite elevated despite a fall in inflation.
Yes.
But the second thing is it is also inflationary, in the sense that when you fail to reach your revenue targets, you have to raise other tax revenues from administered prices. For instance, we saw sin taxes across the board rising, and those things are inflationary, which means for a monetary policy point of view, it means we are not going to get the interest rate cuts that you would otherwise get, because inflation will remain quite elevated because of those taxes that come through. But it's quite positive in the sense that we don't have new taxes that have been imposed on the economy.
Yes.
But from an investment point of view, in terms of signaling, Treasury tells us that they are looking into lowering corporate income tax in future, but that is going to be done in a revenue neutral way, in the sense that they're going to close some of the loopholes through which companies are not paying taxes.
Titi, you can tinker around the edges, put a bit more money in the pockets of consumers and all of that, but to the extent of stimulating investment in the South African economy, did the budget do that?
So that's a tricky one. I think it goes to the credibility thing that Isaiah was talking about, where we actually need businesses to believe. We also need everyone to believe the story, right? So if the unions come to the party and government actually does manage to negotiate the government bill, wage bill, to be what they say it's going to be, then I think that is positive in the long term. But up until that point, when we see that coming through, everyone is going to be a bit skeptical about what does this mean for long term, and do businesses actually start investing again in South Africa, and also the rating agencies, right? So everyone is still waiting for what Moody's is going to say after they analyze. So do we find out on the 27th of March? Some people are thinking possibly they might push it out and say we'll see what happens with the wage negotiation. Yeah. So it's there's a lot here that's still to be. I think today didn't resolve enough.
Yeah.
So I think the short to medium term still very uncertain.
Okay. Don't go anywhere. We're going to cross to my colleague now, Bulelani Philip, who's got a politician with him.
So much, Nombu. Of course, talking about issues of State Bank is one of the biggest announcements that were made firstly during the State of the Nation address and now being confirmed by the Finance Minister. I bring into the conversation Mr. Kes Kuvadia, who is the CEO of the Banking Association of South Africa. Do you take this announcement of the State Bank seriously, or are they just bluffing?
No, we've got to take it seriously. I mean, the President mentioned it in the seminar. The Minister has now put some more meat to it. We still have the view that we need to be convinced why there is a need for a state bank. I think that what we would want to see is an interaction between the commercial banks as they exist today, cooperative banks as they exist today, and government, to see how we can work together to make dysfunctional markets functional. Okay, so my assumption is that the state bank is there to try and service markets that commercial banks are not servicing at the moment.
But does that not indicate that the commercial banks have failed the poor? We also have reports of banks that are racially profiling people. Have you not failed as commercial banks?
No, I don't think we have. If you look at the performance of the banking industry in the last 10 years and the access to financial services that people have in this country, it's gone up significantly. Okay? The reality is that commercial banks, as would the state bank, by the way, be regulated under the Banks Act, regulated by the Prudential Authority, and those regulations put very, very strict conditions on how you are going to use depositors' funds. Now, we expect the state bank, as the minister has said, will operate on commercial principles, and we expect it to operate on commercial principles. So if you cut through the complexity of banking, what's banking about? It's taking depositors' money, gearing that money in the market and raising more money, and then lending that out in a way that there's a more than reasonable possibility that you'll get the money back. If you don't get that money back, you're threatening depositors' funds. State bank can't do anything different. Unless you're saying that if a state bank lends money with no probability of getting that money back, and then when the depositors want the money, the state is going to bail the bank out. Well, we don't have money to bail anything out at the moment, okay?
So are you opposed to this idea of a state bank?
Government wants to form a state bank, they must form a state bank. It's their decision. What I'm saying is that I'm not convinced what a state bank is going to do that commercial banks cannot do currently.
All right, I want us to switch attention now to this idea of a sovereign wealth fund. Can we afford it? Is it feasible?
I agree with the minister. The minister said that this is a long-term plan. I agree with the minister that this is something that we should strive towards, because I think it's good to have a sovereign wealth fund, because that can be utilized in counter-cyclical situations, can be utilized if the country finds itself under serious stress. But I do have a problem, the minister saying that, for instance, one way of funding this would be the income that you get from spectrum or income that you get from elsewhere. Our view would be that any income that the government has that is not utilized for the provision of services and government services must be used to reduce our current debt. We are paying upwards of 15 cents in a rand on our current debt. That stops us from channeling monies to social services. That creates the budget deficit. That creates problems amongst investors and rating agencies and so on. So any additional money we have, we must use to reduce the current debt. As we get toward the situation where we're reducing our budget deficit, getting toward the budget surplus, then we can start putting the sovereign wealth fund on the table, and from surpluses begin to capitalize it.
Keskuvadia, CEO of the Banking Association of South Africa, giving us his view on the state bank and the sovereign wealth fund. Manelisi is standing by for more reaction.
Thank you very much, Bulelane. We're now switching over to the International Women's Forum, and we're joined by Charlene Chanley of the organization. The minister touched on a whole lot of things. What stood out for you?
The one thing that stood out for me is the fact that women was not mentioned in the budget. I don't know if it was an oversight or what, but I assume so. Because remember, we know that the President in the State of the Nation address spoke about gender-based violence, the importance of it, top of the agenda, what needs to be done. So I was a bit disappointed that we didn't hear an allocation of funds specifically towards fighting gender-based violence, because we all know that productivity at the workplace is impacted by gender-based violence. I mean, women can't go to work if they have to if they are beaten up the night before or abused. Children, if you have to look for your children because they've disappeared, it all impacts productivity. So I think maybe it was an oversight in a very well-balanced budget. I mean, overall, in terms of the budget itself, I think it is well-balanced. But the aspect of women is important, that also take top agenda item when we talk about allocation of funds.
But I'm sure you'll take solace to the fact that he announced a whole increase of a number of grants, the majority of which are women who benefit from those.
Yes, of course. But remember, grants, we are addressing the needs of the poor, and I'm very happy at least the increase. There are grants allocated to the elderly and the disabled and to, for parenting. I think it's very, very positive because remember, we also we're almost a welfare state, taking care of between 18 to 21 million people, and so we've gone a long way to address that. But at the end of the day, what is a challenge for us as a country? We have to create jobs. Who's going to create the jobs? It's on the top of the agenda of our president. The CFO, which is our Minister of Finance, has to allocate funds for that. So I think our big challenge is to create jobs, and who's going to do that? It's the small, medium enterprises, allocation of funding towards them, tax incentives, for example, for corporations, and women's businesses. I mean, women are the ones who have to feed their children every day, people from small to medium to large businesses. When women are involved, they will ensure that funds are spread further, and they will stimulate the economy as well. So there's been an allocation. I think we're very happy. There will be a state bank, there will be a sovereign wealth fund, and obviously as part of that allocation, we would also be the ones to advocate that some of that funding needs to go towards women, businesses, small and medium, completely.
Thank you very much. That's Irene Shanley from the International Women's Forum. Nompu, it's back to you.
Thanks very much, Manalisi. Well, I am joined in our studio by Isaiah Mhlanga, Chief Economist at Alexander Forbes, and Titi Hatendi Matika. She's the Head of Retail Investment at ABSA. And so we continue our conversation. Isaiah, I wanted to ask you about the municipalities. Of course, the Finance Minister mentioned specifically some additional funding being given. It's normal anyway that every year municipalities are given a certain level of money and so on. But of course, municipalities do serve as an Achilles heel for us in our society because often there isn't delivery. The Attorney General, the Auditor General, will tell us often that there's a lot of wasteful expenditure and so on. To what extent do you think government is serious about ensuring that municipalities become more effective? And are you confident about the future? Because without the municipalities working, it really is very negative for both business and communities.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the post-Shelf government over the past 2 years or so, it has been speaking about a capable state. And by that, they mean a state which is able to deliver services to the millions of citizens across the country. And the point of a service delivery is at the local government elections, which is municipalities. So to that effect, we have seen a concerted effort or plans to make sure that government is professionalized, but it's going to take some time. We have to agree or to understand that the problems at municipal level are deep and structural, which is why we have a significant number of municipalities that don't even pass audits from the Auditor General. Every year, over 50 billion is lost through fruitless spending because the money is mismanaged. But to capacitate municipalities, it will take some time. Putting the right people that are that can run municipalities efficiently, it will also take some time. But at least from a signaling point of view or a goal point of view, government is looking to professionalize municipalities and capacitate them so that they can run efficiently.
Yeah. Titi, in terms of the municipalities, what's your view?
So if one links to what the President spoke about during the State of the Nation address, talking about generating energy through the municipalities that have clean audits. So one starts to think that government is actually signaling completely that if we fix this, then we also fix the Escom problem, right? So you've got a linkage here where you need to have a solid story. You can't just hope and pray that the municipalities will fix themselves. Government has to help them to enable that to happen. But also within the social compacts that the President keeps talking about, and he mentioned many times during State of the Nation, the people also have to pay. So you can't just expect services and you can't expect municipalities to run without you as the people who receive the services paying for them.
Yeah.
So there has to be that tie-in where, and again it goes to the state of the economy where people are losing jobs. So if I don't have a job, then how am I supposed to pay my bills? So it becomes a chicken and egg story, and once the economy starts going, I think these things get resolved solved, but how do you start the economy going? And that's what government was probably trying to do with this budget.
So earlier I did speak with the Deputy Finance Minister David Masondo, and I asked him about the Sovereign Wealth Fund. I remember at the time that SONA was delivered, many in the private sector just poo-pooed it and said, you know, we've got deficits left and right and centre, budget deficits, and of course a huge debt mound and so on and so forth. But they've gone ahead and created this Sovereign Wealth Fund. They're talking about 30 billion rand. I asked him where it would come from, and he talked about the fact that it would come from, some of it would come from our reserves, which are held by the central bank. The central bank reports to us as the public every month as to how much is there and so on and so forth, and it's there for, you know, as a buffer in case things go wrong in the economy and so on and so forth, and that we'll get it from royalties and all the rest of it. Does it make sense for us to have a sovereign wealth fund when we're not in a primary surplus situation?
Look, I think long-term a sovereign wealth fund is quite useful. You see it in many other countries, the Norwegian countries, even countries like Nigeria do have sovereign wealth fund, but largely it's funded from proceeds from mineral resources. We could have had a sovereign wealth fund in the mid-2000s when the commodity boom was still present, where we still had a lot of mining royalties. But I guess for me, it's separating between mission-critical things and nice-to-haves. And I think at this point in time, we have quite significant problems which require funding. But we haven't demonstrated as a country that we can actually sacrifice some of the spending so that we can save in the sovereign wealth fund. Case in point, the wage agreement with Labour is unlikely to pass because as of yesterday, Labour was saying, look, we are not having it, we are not seeing any cuts to the agreement that we did last year, which will expire next year.
Yes.
So those are the compromises that are needed to make sure that we have some money that can be saved into this sovereign wealth fund. But again, it also assumes that whatever proceeds that come from potential gas discoveries do not have line items that are already earmarked to be spent on, so that this money can be saved in a sovereign wealth fund, which I think at this point in time it's a little bit far-fetched. Long term, it's good, but the current environment may dictate otherwise. But just touching on the reserves that are the Reserve Bank, I will be more confident with the reserves remaining at the Reserve Bank because we know how they are managed. We know it's independent from political influence, but to the extent that this sovereign wealth fund is going to have or to be open to political influence, then we may be creating something that will give us problem in the future.
Hold your many thoughts. We're going to cross now to Manelisi. He's got Mr. Mmusi Maimane with him.
Thank you very much, Nompu. Quite a very familiar face here, former leader of the DA, Mr. Mmusi Maimane. Mr. Maimane, what was your specific interest in this budget?
Yeah, one, we came here because I think it's important that we realize that we live in two South Africas. You know, there's a South Africa that today was looking for news about SAA, and there's a South Africa where people use taxis, buses, and transport. So I wanted to come and understand how we bridge the gap. Today, we gave 18 billion rands to SAA and didn't give much to poor South Africans who depend on public transport. And ultimately, I think that we could have taken an opportunity to say, what taxes do we use to help small businesses, to help people create more jobs? Because if we can say to someone, if you create a job, we'll give you this tax cut, I think we'll go a long way to be able to help create an economy that creates more jobs for people.
Let me get your take on the creation of the state bank. Do you think it will succeed?
Well, the history of this country has shown that when you create a pool of money, then that money is vulnerable to being captured, to people taking it away. I think as South Africa, we don't have money to be creating a state bank. I think we should be much more focused on other things. This is not a priority for us now. What ought to be happening is if we create development finances, there's already institutions that are available for that, the Land Bank and other banks. And what we should be doing is partnering with the private sector for the purposes of development and stimulating actual economic growth. That's what we need.
Mr. Maimane, thank you very much for your time. That's the former leader of the DA, Mr. Mmusi Maimane, opposed to the formation of the state bank. Let me now go to my colleague Bulelane, who's serving a guest out there.
All right, thank you so much, Manelisi. I've got the Justice and Constitutional Development Minister, Ronald Lamola, but I'll speak to him in a moment. But to join the conversation now is the Progressive Professionals Forum. Sorry, it's a tongue twister. Azania Matiwane, is this a progressive budget in your view?
Well, this is a frank and honest budget, first of all, under the conditions. You must remember
The revenue base is very thin. Jobs are being shed every day because of also the issue of the global downturn economically. So you would expect that this is going to be the situation. But however, one thing that we're happy about is that there's some homegrown reforms that have been introduced. One of them is around the issue of the cut on, well, not really a cut, but not significant cut on income taxes, which is very important. But the other thing that is important is that, you see, policy slippage is a problem in the country, and this is making many investors to be nervous. And this pronounced itself in a form of unfulfilled promises that have happened. For instance, you've got the issue of the state capture. There's not a single person that has been arrested at this point in time. But we are happy that this budget has prioritized, for instance, in giving more resources to the NPA so that it can be able to effect those. So perhaps after this budget, there can be able to be some sort of recovery in terms of the confidence into the country. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Azania Matiwane from the Progressive Professionals Forum. I'm going to bring into conversation now Ronald Lamola, Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. Mr. Lamola, before we talk budget, you've informed Parliament of the provisional suspension of the Chief Magistrate of Pretoria, Desmond Naya. Why is that?
Yeah, obviously there were allegations, and the allegations have now been looked upon by the Judicial Service Commission, by the Magistrate Commission, and the Magistrate Commission has confirmed that there is a case to be answered by the Chief Magistrate, and they have recommended that I must suspend the Chief Magistrate, which I have concurred with their recommendation, and hence we have informed Parliament.
For the benefit of our viewers at home, the allegation is in relation to Bosasa. Just give us a background of how this allegation came about.
Yeah, obviously I'm not at liberty to talk a lot about what are the allegations and so forth, except what we have informed Parliament, which relates to a benefit of about 200,000 or an alleged benefit in terms of security issues, and we will prefer to leave it there and allow the evidence to be led at the hearing so that we don't prejudice anyone in the process, and allow the evidence to be led at the hearing. And we believe the hearing will be free and fair, and the issues will be properly ventilated there.
Turning to the budget, 2.4 billion for your department to increase capacity of both investigators and prosecutors. Is that enough? Because people are dying to see arrests being made in relation to corruption.
Yeah, obviously there will never be enough money for government. We always want lots, but in our view this is a very good injection by the National Treasury. It almost came like a Father Christmas for the NPA in particular. As you are aware, they have not been able to fill vacancies in the past 5 years. The vacancy rate at the NPA is almost sitting at 20%, which is huge, which the institution has almost been hemorrhaged, and we're of the view that this is a good start, it's a good foundation, and it will help the NPA to turn around the corner. And it's also good that the injection is not only for the NPA, it goes to the Hawks, the SAPS, and this injection then, if it deals with two police and the NPA, is good, because we have always said when you deal with the police in terms of budget and resources, you must also deal with the NPA in terms of budget and resources, because when the workload increase for the SAPS, it also increase inevitable for the NPA. So I think it was a good intervention by the National Treasury, and we are believing that is a good start to turn the corner around in the institution.
When do we see arrests? Is the NPA, in your view, acting swiftly? Because people want to see arrests.
Yeah, obviously the issue of arrest is a question that you will have to ask the NPA and the Hawks, because the NPA and the Hawks, they then decide based on the evidence and the facts before them, and including the law, whether there is any matter that needs to be prosecuted or for any arrest. So that is for them. Ours, we create an enabling environment for them. We give them the support in terms of resource, in terms of legislation, which we have done, the NPA Act, and also the Constitution, which says they must do their job without any fear, favor or prejudice to anyone. And we are of the view that they are doing their job. They are, at the right time, they will be able to inform South Africans of whatever decisions that they have taken.
We'll definitely await that right time. Ronald Lamola is the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. For more reaction, Nompu is standing by in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. Well, we continue to have conversation with Isaiah Mhlanga and Titi Hatendi Matika, pardon me, here in studio. So I wanted to talk to you about infrastructure. Infrastructure is very important because obviously you need to invest now in infrastructure so that that infrastructure can impact on communities, business and so on, and then we can see economic growth thereafter. But I always find that it's quite vague, the information around infrastructure. We heard about the DBSA, the Development Bank of Southern Africa, investing 200 billion rand, government investing in 10 billion rand. What's going on with the infrastructure fund as far as you can understand, and are we getting clarity of communication in this regard?
I think if you go back to the President's State of the Nation, he spoke about 700 billion infrastructure fund over the next 10 years. And you would also remember we had some 2 investment conferences which focused specifically at attracting investment, and that investment is earmarked to go into, by and large, infrastructure in different sectors of the economy, which reduces the cost base of the economy, improves efficiency. They speak about opening up sectors that have been dominated by SOEs to the private sector, whether it's in roads, it's in ports, it's in rail, all those sectors which are quite important, which forms the bedrock of an economy. But government's role there is one that needs to take the initial big risk, but it needs to crowd in private sector investment. By and large, 80% of total investment in the country comes from the private sector. So until we are able to attract the private sector to come and invest in these infrastructure projects, we are not going to be able to do it. So which is why the signaling of reduction in corporate income tax in the years to come. We don't know when that will be. It's going to be quite important because it may attract some of the foreign direct investments to come into those sectors, which can actually boost infrastructure investment.
Titi, the corporate income tax is but one variable that investors would be looking at. But of course, we always bandy around that policy uncertainty. How are we doing in that regard?
So I think if you go back to the infrastructure fund and the thinking around it, right, for investors, the key thing, and I think a lot of people, when the president first mentioned smart cities, for instance, last year in his State of Nation after elections, people actually laughed at it. Some people said, oh, what are you talking about, smart cities? And they've been latching onto that. So today you would have heard Minister of Finance talking about, Lanseria, and this year we also heard the president talking about the smart cities again. And these are the sorts of things where we need to start thinking outside the box, right? Technology, fourth industrial revolution, these are all things that are happening fast, and South Africa is so behind the curve in some of these areas. So the minister also talked about education and focusing on technology and technicons, new universities. So these are the sorts of things that start to feed into this infrastructure fund, and also businesses investing. So how we look at it as investors, is it bankable projects? So can the government come up with, within these smart cities, projects that may be green projects that you as an investor starts latching onto ESG, and we can sell it onto our direct customers.
ESG, you're talking fancy terms. Define that.
So environmentally friendly investments, those things that speak to the consumer who is worried about the future, who's worried about climate change. And these are things that they're thinking very far ahead, but it's things that you can't start thinking about when they're happening. You need to start building. And I think they're building on that story. Yes. And while some people laughed, you can see the thread, the golden thread here. And I think it does have legs, and investors will latch onto it if they have solid structures, and again, if these projects are bankable and we can actually see returns from them.
I think it's quite important just to add to that, to say for ordinary people that work, that have pensions, it's one of the investment avenues actually to augment returns that you get from the JSE, because over the past 5 years you will see traditional asset classes like equities, bonds, they have been declining in terms of their returns. Now we look at other asset classes that are outside of the traditional listed space to try and augment those returns, and infrastructure is one of the asset classes which have been performing quite well over the past couple of years. And I think then it also joined the need to transform the economy, at the same time giving a return to investors. So it achieves both. So it's a good opportunity. It just needs to provide bankable projects which can prove to say from a risk-adjusted return, it's a good return that you would get than what you normally get from traditional asset classes.
Super. Hold your thought there. We're going to cross over to Bulelani.
All right, thank you so much, Nompu. Whether this budget is pro-poor or for working class people is something that we need to find out. COSATU's spokesman, Matthew Parks, joins me now in this conversation. Matthew, let's start with this wage bill. Are you guys prepared to renegotiate a multi-year agreement?
Look, we're not willing to renegotiate this year's agreement. We signed it in good faith. We made certain compromises. The current year's financial wage agreement is the lowest in about 11 years. So it's an extreme act of bad faith and poor negotiations by government to yesterday to indicate to us they want to withdraw from this year's agreement. So as far as Labour is concerned, we can't withdraw from it. We're willing to discuss next year and the following 3 years agreements. We're willing to put compromise on the table. Areas we think we can save, reduce the fat, etc. But we can't negotiate in good faith that governments can sign an agreement and afterwards seek to run away from it.
What will you guys do if they call you to the table and want to reduce it?
Look, they'll force workers into a corner, and I wouldn't be surprised if workers then decide to go on strike. That's workers' tool of negotiation. But it's extremely reckless. We tabled proposals to government and to the Alliance in November last year around a holistic package of reforms, interventions from Escom, the SOEs, the economy, taxes, even the wage bill. They refused to engage. They just ignored us. They said, we'll meet next month. Yet yesterday, a day before the budget speech, they come and say we want to withdraw from the agreement. It makes it very difficult for us to take them seriously, to negotiate in good faith. But look, we're willing as COSATU to still engage. We have no choice. We have to engage because it's our members whose jobs, whose salaries on the line. It's the families who depend upon them. So we've got proposals on how to reduce wasteful expenditure, how to improve tax reform, even how to save money on the wage bill, especially on top and in the entities. But government has to negotiate in good faith with us.
161 billion reduction over the next 3 years for the wage bill. You probably don't know where it's going to come from. Where must it go to? Are you going to agree to that reduction?
Look, we think there are many areas where we can save money in government. First thing is the Auditor General says we lose 10% of our budget every year to wasteful expenditure and corruption. Government is silent upon that. You need to plug the loopholes, the gaps, before you start looking at other issues. There are also ways to increase tax revenue by capacitating SARS, dealing with the rich who evade paying taxes, dealing with customs enforcement evasion. There's also ways to reprioritize expenditure from within the state to invest in industrial strategies. In the wage bill, there are ways to address issues. You can put the public sector entities under the Public Service Bargaining Council because that's where you really see the ballooning of management wages. You can put ceiling caps on what management earns in the entities. You can reduce what ministers, mayors, premiers, the president, etc. earn significantly. You can reduce what the managers, what the DGs earn. I mean, you can do that in a way which protects public servants, teachers and nurses, police officers, prison wardens, right to a living wage, right to inflation increases, etc. But you have to do it in a smart way. This bull in a China shop approach of government, it really makes life very difficult, and it makes it very difficult for workers to take them seriously.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew Parks, COSATU spokesman. Of course, the workers are on a war path over the government wage bill. From us here in the precinct, from my colleague Maneli Situbas and myself, Bulelani Philippe, it's a wrap from us. And Nombu, it's back to you in studio.
Thanks very much, Bulelani. So my colleague Bulelani was just speaking to COSATU just now, and they're on a war path around this wage bill, public sector wage bill cut. As the government negotiates with the public sector for the next 3 years, next year is also the national government elections, the local government elections. What is your view on what's going to happen on that one?
I think this is how you can put it. This budget is a compromise on the need for political stability, the need for a private sector-led economic growth, and also the need for transformation. In this case, Labour got something, no tax increases, but for next year, it's unlikely that COSATU is going to agree to cut wages because the agreement has already been signed. You can't rescind on it, but going forward, potentially, if we could get compromises from Labour, that can help. But as it stands, it seems very difficult, which means there is significant execution risk for this budget because it depends a lot on the ability of National Treasury to negotiate with Labour to cut wages.
I'm going to give you the last minute to just give us, anything important that you think has come out of the budget that you want to speak on.
So I think not having a VAT increase for me in the last minute is quite important. I think some people did think it was possible, and particularly for the consumer, this is very good, and for inflation. So at least to anchor inflation and to keep interest rates lower, I think this is quite positive. So that's my last word.
Super. Thank you very much to both of you. That was Titi Hatendi Matika. She's the head of retail investment at ABSA, and of course Isaiah Mhlanga, he's the chief economist at Alexander Forbes. It's been a pleasure bringing the budget speech to you and all the other associated stories around it. I want to thank my colleagues who also made this happen, Bulelani Philip and Manelisa Dubase. Of course, the reporters as well, who are going to be bringing you comprehensive packages on what came out of the budget as well. We do wish you a wonderful afternoon.
Right, thank you very much to our colleagues in Cape Town, Nompulelo Siziba, together with Manelisi Dubase as well as Bulelani Philip, giving you rolling coverage of the budget speech for 2020 by Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Well, the budget has been under scrutiny and analysis throughout the afternoon, and we'll get more deep into things as we'll be talking about government, talking about reforms to the procurement system with a focus of value of money and maximizing quality and quantity of services, and also cabinet approving publication of new public procurement bill. We will also be reflecting on other issues that came out of Parliament regarding assisting SMMEs to be sustainable so that they can create those much needed jobs, a focus and a little touch on how government is intending to assist the SOEs. There has been mention of how local governments which are in good standing can be able to buy power from independent power generators, as well as other issues that we'll be talking about concerning the public healthcare system and allocation of money to the Department of Education. There's so much to talk about, so how about we take a break and we thresh it out with my analysts that are in the studio here. I'll introduce them to you in a moment. We'll be back.
Get a 750ml JNB blended Scotch whiskey and a 1-liter Schweppes soda water for only $169.99. Only at the Tops at Spas Zip Fest.
That's great value, eh?
Billy! Billy, you have to sing! Sing! Billy! Not for persons under the age of 18.
It's the month of love, and we have our pulse on the hottest love trends of this season. We love travel so much, we know all the romantic getaways. Don't even get us started on those couple goals. We shake things up and get creative when it comes to expressing that 4-letter word. When it comes to those essential romantic spoils, we are the gift that keeps on giving. Wherever the beat takes us, we will be right there, tapping to the rhythm of love. So go on, share love with us this month.